Chapter 15. When they reached the barbed wire fence along the river, Pat pushed his horse ahead of the others to the gate and swung off and opened them for them to ride through. He led his horse through last and pretended to have a little trouble getting the gate shut. Boxley rode on into the river to let his horse drink from the running water. Lingering behind on the bank, Ezra witnessed an astonishing thing. As soon as he was sure Boxley was far enough away not to notice, Pat quit pretending to try and shut the gate. Instead, he dragged it back, leaving the gap in the wire fence wide open. Shocked by this breach of range etiquette, Ezra reined his horse back as Pat swung into the saddle and asked harshly, "Did that one drink of tequila make you plumb drunk, Pat?" "I'm not drunk." "You left that gate open." Pat replied, "Shut up, or Box'll hear you. We may be coming back across here in a hurry tonight." "What you got planned?" Ezra asked in a low voice as they waded through into the water. "Nothing," said Pat simply. "Just depends on what happens." Their horses splashed into the water, and they joined the XL rancher on midstream. "We'll have to ride past Brocco, downriver a piece," Boxley told them. "Then we'll go on and look at the herd." "How far is it?" "The herd? Only a couple miles up into the foothills behind Brocco." They rode a short distance, and Boxley asked suddenly, "You got cash with you to pay for this stuff?" Pat laughed and shook his head. "Hell no. I ain't got no cash with me." "I thought you were ready to close the deal," Boxley complained. "We may be from Colorado, but we ain't crazy enough to carry a pile of cash around in the Big Bend," Pat assured him. "How do you expect to pay for the stock if you decide to buy them?" Pat pretended to ruminate a moment. "Well, the way I understand the deal is like this. You don't want to try smuggling the stuff back across the border here." "Exactly. It'd be too dangerous with the Rialis keeping tabs on the herd. That's one reason I'm eager to sell to someone who doesn't live in the Big Bend. It'd be safer to drive them upstream on the Mexican side, and then the Rialis will realize their suspicions was wrong, and they won't follow the herd to see what comes of it. Once they're safely upriver 100 miles or so, they can be swum across at night without anyone getting wiser." "That's agreeable to me," Pat told him. "While they're being drove upstream, they'll be getting closer to Colorado anyway. Right under El Paso's a good place to put 'em across, ain't it?" "Yeah, that is. It's a good open stretch of river there with lots of fords." "I can give you a draft on an El Paso bank," Pat told him. "That suits you all right?" "Sure, an El Paso draft would be fine. How much are you ready to pay?" "I ain't even seen 'em yet," Pat reminded him. Boxley laughed heartily. "I guarantee they're the slickest range-fed stuff you'll look at in a long time." "Are half of them heifers?" "That's right. The rest are cows and steers. Not a cow over 5 years old." "Well, I ain't making an offer," Pat warned him cautiously, "but from what you say, $20 a head all around." $20 a head? Boxley turned in the saddle to stare at him. "You must be joking." "Nope, I'm plumb serious." "They're worth twice that." "Not to you they ain't," Pat told him. "You got hold of a hot potato and it's gonna burn you if you don't drop it quick. Anything you can get out of it in a hurry is better than having the Mexican government take 'em all." "Well, yeah, but $20. "I'm ready to make a deal with you tonight," Pat pressed him. "After I look 'em over, you can start driving them upriver and get them out of danger if that's what you're saying. But I won't be paying more than $20 a head." "That's robbery." Boxley frowned. I told you I was looking for a bargain. All right, if we make the deal tonight, I want to get him started out of there, Boxley sighed. The lights of Brock were beginning to show up in front of them, and Boxley pointed them out and said, I'll stop there and pick up some trail riders. Might as well get the herd started after you look 'em over. They were trotting into the little town of Brocco. A half-dozen adobe buildings on the main street showed lit windows, and Boxley pulled up in front of a canteen and said, I'll go in here. It won't be but a minute. He swung off, went in without inviting them to follow him. Ezra looked at Pat and said reflectively, So you're going to be buying 400 head of stuff at $20 a head? Me, I ain't very good at figures, but that seems to add up to a lot of money. And since when have you been keeping money in El Paso Bank that you can draw on? What kind of doggone monkey business you up to, Pat? Pat grinned. This is what they call high finance in the city, where one slicker outslicks another slicker. He slid out of the saddle. Let's go on in and get ourselves a drink. Ezra gladly accepted the situation and followed him into the saloon. Boxley stood at the bar talking to two whiskered men in rough clothing. He looked up with a frown of annoyance when he saw his two companions coming in the door. He pulled away from the bar, saying something in a low tone to the men, and they followed him to the back of the room. The bartender was a half-breed, wearing an undershirt and dirty white pants. There were 3 other Americans in the saloon and 1 Mexican group together at the other end of the bar. They watched Pat and Ezra come in, and said nothing as the 2 men bellied up to the bar. Got any American whiskey? Pat asked. Si, senor. $1 for the drink. Better make it a big drink for that. He clanked 2 silver dollars on the bar and turned casually and looked back towards Boxley in the rear. Boxley had a worried look on his face. He appeared to be questioning the 2 men sharply. He glanced up and saw that Pat and Ezra were having a drink, and then nodded to one of the men, took his arm, and went out the rear door with him. The other man sauntered up to the group at the end of the bar and said something in a low voice and nodded his head at Pat and Ezra. I thought we might find Dusty in here, Pat said outside the corner of his mouth. I noticed a KT horse outside. That's what he rode on across. He ain't in here, Pat said, and then turned his attention to his drink. Pat picked up his glass and studied it a minute. In a low voice he muttered, I'd sure like to know where Lon ducked out to. Wish you'd start up a fracas so I could slip out without being noticed particular. Ezra tossed down his drink and beamed at Pat. Well, I'd admire to do that. Ain't had no fun since we started this trip. He sidled around Pat and stared at the other men. What's that I heard you fellers say? He demanded loudly. They all looked at him in surprise. Pat grabbed his arm and begged loudly. Don't start no trouble, Ezra. Come on, get out of here. Let's go. Cool down. Ezra shook his hand off angrily. One of them fellers just insulted us. I heard him plain. I'm gonna bust his head wide open. He started towards them, big fists swinging like pendulums. Suit yourself. I ain't staying for no fireworks, Pat said. He backed towards the front door and out. He paused long enough to see Ezra shaking his fist at the group. They were grinning at the one-eyed man with the good-natured tolerance of sober men for a drunkard. Pat turned away from the door and trotted noiselessly along the side of the building. Light came from a small window set high in the wall near the back end of the saloon. Pat heard voices coming from inside as he reached the window. He pressed against the mud wall underneath and listened. He heard Dusty's voice saying angrily, But I tell you I ain't him. My name's Dusty Morgan, and I can prove it if you'd let me out of here." There was a low murmur that sounded like Boxley, and then Dusty again. "Sure, I know all about that. He was wearing my clothes. I traded with him after he got killed. I wanted them to think he was me. There's a posse after me for killing the Marfa sheriff. Whoever held up the stage knows he was killing Ben Thurston. He hollered out his name just before they blasted him." A loud screech of pain sounded from the front part of the saloon, then a crash of a chair against the wall, and the infuriated bellow of Ezra. Pat heard running feet from inside the room and heard an inner door slam. He reached up and caught the sill with his fingertips and pulled himself to a quick look into the room. Dusty was stretched out on the floor, bound tightly with a rope. He didn't see Pat peering in. The sound of a loud brawl was gaining volume in the front. Rising above all the other noises was Ezra's voice, whooping it up happily as he obeyed Pat's order to create a disturbance. Pat dropped back down to the ground, sprinted around to the front door. Boxley and the man who had gone out with him re-entered from the rear just as Pat was bursting into the front. There was a rolling mass of fighting men on the floor with Ezra in the middle of it. One figure already lay limply astride, and one man stumbled out of the melee holding his wrist as Pat ran in. The man with Boxley pulled his gun and ran towards the group rolling on the floor. He tried to get a beat on Ezra and found it difficult because they were constantly shifting positions. Pat ran forward and shouted at the top of his lungs, "Ezra! Stop it, Ezra!" The tangle of men suddenly disintegrated, with one man flying in one direction and another in another. Ezra got to his feet with a grin. "I didn't mean no harm, Pat. I was just sort of funning." Pat grabbed his arm and gave him a shove towards the door. "You get outside and sober up." He turned to Boxley. "I'm sorry he gets fighting drunk every so often." The men who had unwisely engaged in battle with him were gathering themselves up and counting the damage. The Mexican was out cold on the floor with a broken jaw, but the Americans were only scratched and battered. "Forget it," Boxley told them impatiently when they began muttering threats of reprisal. "We got work to do. I want you boys to round up all my Starbucks Cross stuff and get 'em ready to move up the river towards El Paso. This man's buying 'em from me. Delivery on the other side of the river." "You stay here, Thad," he told the hulking man with piggish eyes and undershot jaw. "You take care of Pedro and see that he gets his jaws bandaged, and take care of everything else too." He jerked his head towards the rear. Thad nodded and limped over to squat down by the unconscious Mexican. "The rest of you, come with me," Boxley said shortly and strode out of the cantina. Pat let him proceed. He got on his horse slowly and let them ride ahead with Boxley while Ezra fell in behind with them. The big man's clothing was torn and his scarred face was streaked with blood, but there was still a joyous light in his single eye. "How'd I do?" he demanded happily. "I didn't tell you to start a massacre," Pat told him. "You could have just argued, couldn't you?" "Well, yeah, but fighting's more fun. It only got one good wallop at the Mex before the others jumped in. It was pretty good while it lasted. What'd you find out?" Pat held his horse back so they would remain out of earshot of the others. He told Ezra what he had seen and heard in the back room of the cantina. "They got him tied up in there and you went off and left him?" Ezra demanded. "That's right. I think he's safe enough until Boxley finds out who he is, and I want to get the cattle moved up the river." "How do you figure Boxley? What's his game?" "Seems plain enough to me," Pat snorted. He's been having his men pretend to help Katy while she's being smuggled poor, so she'd give in and sell the ranch, or maybe even marry him. He's scared of having anyone help her out for fear she'd change her mind. That's why he's keeping Dusty tied up, till he's sure who he really is, or it's too late for Katy to change her mind. The group ahead of them had changed and stopped to go through a pasture gate. They were in low foothills behind Baracco, a pretty good grazing country. The moon and stars were giving enough light to distinguish things pretty well. Boxley reined back beside Pat and Ezra as the others rode through the gate. "This is the pasture they're in," he told them. "We'll stay here and let 'em drive 'em out past us. You can look 'em over and make a count. Is that fair enough?" "Fair enough," Pat agreed. "You get on the other side of the gate, Ezra, and keep a tally with me. That way we'll be somewhere near about right." Boxley pulled aside with Pat. "It won't take 'em long to start coming," he muttered. "This is a little pasture, and they're so fat they're quite easily being to be drove." Pat rolled a cigarette while they waited. He could hear the riders further up in the hills, could hear an occasional shout as they started the split hooves down towards the gate. It wasn't long before the vanguard of the herd showed up in the moonlight, a confused mass of broad-backed white faces, bawling at each other at being woken from their sleep, trotting and shoving to get through the narrow gate. Boxley hadn't lied about the shape they were in. They were the fattest stuff Pat had ever seen on hoof in his life, and each one was branded with the star box cross which Boxley had described to them. Pat didn't have any more time for thinking. He was busy trying to keep a tally on the fat cows that crowded through the gate in the moonlight. It takes an old hand at the business to make a correct count of a herd like that. It isn't really just a matter of counting each separate head that passes. You sort of let your subconscious mind take hold, and you find a total rolled up in your mind after you've done it long enough. An expert at the business, Pat kept his eye on the moving mass of broad backs in front of him, and let his instinct do the adding. The herd began to thin out after a time, and the riders were whooping it up behind the stragglers, pushing them forward to keep a compact herd with the others. As the last ones went through the gate, Lon Boxley directed the herders, "Turn 'em upriver and keep moving. I'll send a chuck wagon and more riders from my ranch across the river to catch up with you by morning, and it'll make a regular trout outfit. What'd you make out for a number, Pat?" Pat replied, "My tally is 368. He raised his voice to get Ezra's attention. "What'd you get?" 371. Ezra called back, reining across to him. "Well, that's close enough," Boxley said with satisfaction. "My count was 372. "Well, we'll call her 370, Pat said. "That's a heap of money even at $20, Ezra argued aloud. "Yep." Pat Stevens sounded very cheerful about it, as though it didn't hurt his non-existent El Paso bank account at all. "I'll calculate that too." He paused for a slow mental calculation. "About $7,400 all told." "Well, that's about what I make it," Boxley agreed. He got off his horse to close the gate. "I'll give you the Mexican's name the draft is to be made out to when we get back at my ranch." He remounted, and the three men started riding slowly towards Baracco at the rear of the herd that was being moved up towards river. End of chapter 15.